The other day, I was listening to the Michael Shermer show. Michael Shermer had a guest on the show. This was a journalist named David Zweig, and he's done some writing on COVID lockdowns and school shutdowns. And one thing that he was talking about was the limitations of using science to form public policy. And I really liked what he was saying. I actually wrote down the quote because I was so inspired by it and wanted to talk about it some more with you guys. He was saying the reality is science doesn't tell you to close schools or open schools. It doesn't tell you that. It gives you information, but then you make a choice based on your values what to do with that information. And I really love that because I think it talks about the idea of starting from the right framework, that you start from the framework of what your values are and then use science at that point to determine if what you're doing is in support of that or not. And when I thought about it, I feel like I can really apply that idea to a lot of the hotly contested political issues today. One example of that is abortion is probably the most contested issue, and I do hear scientific arguments about all kinds of when is the fetus viable outside of the womb? When does the fetus begin moving? When does it get a heartbeat? When does it get unique genetic material? All of this to make the argument of a fetus being a living being deserving of its own rights. And what I don't think it's acknowledging, and therefore nobody is being convinced by this, is the fact that whether or not the fetus is a human life is not the only issue that's being questioned and that's at stake here. I did mention in another one of my earlier videos that there are cases where harming people and even killing people is part of our value system here in America. I guess there's probably some disagreement about to what extent it is okay to go to war and kill people or to lock people up and give them the death penalty. I think just about everybody I've come across at least believes that when it comes to self-defense, it is okay to kill other people. But I think a lot of what's going on with the abortion debate is the question of what is the value of a woman's bodily autonomy and control over her future. And if keeping another person alive means that the woman has to devote resources from her own body to sustain that other being, and potentially if she keeps the baby, that she has to significantly redirect her future to take care of the baby, is that a circumstance where it is okay to stop a fetus from developing in order to preserve the rights of that mother? And so that's the thing where I think it's not just about the science of what does it say about human life, but also what are you valuing? Are you valuing the life of a not yet fully formed fetus, or are you valuing the autonomy of a grown woman, not necessarily a grown woman, a girl who has at least hit puberty, in determining how her body is being used in this world, as well as the future path that she wants to take. I think another example of this, another place where I hear the idea of following the science a lot, is when it comes to climate change. And I think a lot of the dissension when it comes to making policies that help climate change. Well, first of all, there's the idea that if we commit to this, we need to have other countries that have big energy expenditures commit to this too. And if they don't and we do, then we're just on the losing end of things. But I think there's also a lot of resistance from areas that maybe feel that they would be personally affected in a negative way, in the sense that, for instance, if you live in a coal mining community, and coal mining is bad for the environment, and we're looking for ways to get rid of that, potentially you could lose your job and your whole community and your whole town could just be thrown into disarray because of that. And I do definitely hear people pushing back and being like, oh, well, the science is biased or whatever. But I think a lot of times if scientific facts are just supporting your values anyways, then you're going to be inclined to believe them, and you're much more inclined to be resistant if there's some other values that are at stake there. Another example of this is the gender debates recently of if you are chromosomally a male or female, biologically a male or a female, the science says one thing, but it's treating a person differently from what the science says is going to make the person feel in a better mental state, more safe, less likely to do self-harm, more comfortable. At what point do you push aside science and say, hey, I'm not saying this is completely useless, but there are other values here that we have to consider. And then I do also want to talk about the flip side, which is science and values should be kept separate, but they're not always kept separate. And I do think there are instances where we have to be careful about citing the science because values can end up creeping into science. And one example of this that I just want to at least mention is something called the Grievance Studies Affair. And this was something that happened in the last decade where a group of 3 authors wrote a series of scientific papers, and they had to do with controversial political issues like gender theory or critical race theory. And they falsified data, they used false, bad methodology. And the idea behind it was that they wanted to see, could these papers get published because they were pushing ideas that were in support of a popular and controversial issue right now. And what happened was it ended up being successful enough that they had to stop the study early because not only were these papers getting published, but one paper was even getting awards for its great, scientific innovation or something like that. And the authors of the study were actually being invited to journals to peer review other papers, and it got to the point where it was just getting so outrageous and dishonest that they had to come clean and say, hey, this is what we were doing. And the idea behind it was showing how if you're using shoddy research techniques, falsifying information, but what you're saying is in support of a certain dogma, that it can potentially get published anyways. So you need to be careful that values aren't creeping into science. And so I think ultimately the idea behind this is that science and values are very intertwined, and they're both relevant and necessary for forming public policy, but we have to be careful about not getting them intertwined too early in the process. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, do not be letting your values creep into the scientific method and the peer review process. And on the other hand, if you are trying to talk people into your point of view by citing science, but your point of view starts from a presumed moral framework that the people you're talking to do not share, then your efforts to convince them of science are going to fail. And you really need to start with philosophy and get to a more common set of values that you want to be working towards before you take that next step of applying science to it.